Hey everyone, welcome to Tenian's Corner. I'm here with my brother Dan, and we're going to do another segment of our after hour screen talk. All right, so let's dive right into the topic of today's video. We're going to explore, look at the various iterations of Conan the Barbarian, the various film adaptations that have been made. And we're going to go through each version, each film version, and look at like what worked and what may have not worked in those various iterations. But we're going to start with the first film, which came out in 1982, Conan the Barbarian, which was really, I would say, Arnold Schwarzenegger's like breakout movie, which really put him on the map as a big leading man, big star. And we're going to go through and talk about these films in terms of their character, their story, how is the world building, and also importantly, the action, because the fight scenes, the battle scenes are a big draw. And if they nail those, they get a lot right. If you don't know this already, the character was created by writer author Robert E. Howard. The first Conan story was published in the pulp magazines of the 1930s. Like the first one was The Phoenix on the Sword, I believe, in 1932.
Robert E. Howard's Conan tales take place in a world that is sort of alongside but directly up against our own. It's a world that we recognize as very similar to our own. So there are clear analogs between Conan as a Cimmerian and then, of course, the ancient Celts, which was a major source of inspiration for the Conan character.
Howard calls it the Hyborian Age. That's the setting, historical setting of the Conan stories. You know, after Atlantis, the city of Atlantis sank in the water, you had this cataclysm. There's actually almost like a post-apocalyptic sense to Conan's world, which is interesting when we get into some of the production history of the first movie, Conan the Barbarian. Eventually, John Milius, the director, helmed the project, and he really rewrote the script. But the script originally was in the hands of Oliver Stone, of all people, who you wouldn't have guessed that he would have his hands in Conan. He wrote this script that was going to be intended to be like 3 hours long and different from the original stories in terms of its context because it was set in this like post-apocalyptic future, and Oliver Stone was like high on drugs, on cocaine when he was writing this. And I think John Milius, when he read the script, he said even it definitely felt like the person who wrote this had it was having a fever dream, acid trip. uh, but still, I would have been so curious to see what that movie would look like if it had been made. But I mentioned the post-apocalyptic vibe of Conan, and so that's interesting that maybe Oliver Stone like picked up on that. Arnold Schwarzenegger, perfect, iconic casting for that role. In terms of the portrayal of Conan here, he speaks little, he's very stoic.
I have trouble being objective when I think about Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's a one-of-a-kind screen presence, a one-of-a-kind action film hero type. And so when I think about him as Conan, yeah, I think he totally sells it.
Yeah.
And as little dialogue as there is in the film, I think he sells the dialogue he has. That famous battle prayer that he speaks to Crom, that's one of the sequences of dialogue that I've got memorized.
Yeah.
I can still quote that word for word today, and I haven't seen the film, although I watched it on repeat for a little while now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's because Schwarzenegger sells it. First of all, it's great dialogue. It's broad, it's florid, it's exactly as it should be in a Conan film. But I think that Schwarzenegger sells it, and I think he sells it in the way that you were talking about with his presence, right? It's this sort of like very kind of cold, stoic, austere kind of Conan. It's a different kind of interpretation of one vein of the character as opposed to what you see in the original stories. So
Yeah.
this is, Conan in his internalized, brooding, philosophical state of mind, and that's where Schwarzenegger places him for the most part.
Yeah.
And I think he sells it totally. I think he's utterly convincing.
The villain, James Earl Jones, coming right off Star Wars, playing another iconic villain, also Doom, a similar kind of villain too, because in this movie, plot wise, he's almost a spiritual father to Conan. It's like Batman and the Joker kind of thing. Like, no, I made you, or like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. Like I'm your father in the way. I think he even calls him my son, right? At some point.
Yeah, no, it's again, these lines of dialogue stick with you.
Yeah.
He's like, I am the wellspring from which you flow. Without me, you will have never been.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
will your world be without me, my son?
Yeah.
And then Conan has this real moment where it's like where he almost has this philosophical crisis. It's like, wow, what will I be?
That's the other thing about this first movie. You're expecting a somewhat like cheesy sword and sorcery movie, maybe a bit disposable.
Let's
Hopefully,
be honest, it is that. It is
yeah,
very
yeah.
cheesy if cheese is what you're looking for.
Yes, it has that exploitative factor to it, even pornographic at times. I mean, it has that big orgy scene, violent orgy scene at the end, and it's totally exploiting the erotic elements and the violence.
But then it wouldn't be camp if there wasn't also this serious visceral investment in the objects of camp. If there wasn't this dimension of emotional depth to them, if they weren't sensual objects capable of capturing our imagination, then we're no longer talking about camp. We're just talking about bad art. So camp is distinct from that, I think. And again, I think Schwarzenegger is a focal point for this. He is sort of a prototypically campy film presence because you get both those valences of camp. You've got that ironic distance, this sort of underlying implied humor, but then you've also got the fact that I believe him I believe totally and invest in him in his films. He is the Terminator. He is Conan.
Yeah,
And when he says the prayer is Conan, I believe him. I invest in it.
yeah,
He gives me that field of affective fantasy to invest in, and
yeah,
it's real and it's sincere, and there's not an ounce of irony taking away from that connectivity and that sensuality.
yeah.
Um, and that's camp in a nutshell.
It is, and that is perfectly uh, a perfect explanation of camp, and I think it really hits home, particularly with his performance. I think he was playing it straight, utterly straight, and that's what makes the film sometimes unintentionally campy and funny. Like in that line where he's saying to crush your enemies, see them driven before you. I think Arnold is saying that line in utter sincerity, but it comes off as campy, unintentionally funny because it has that absurdity to it, and also just the sheer kind of insanity of what he's saying. That he's saying that with a straight face. I think what you said about the resonant great dialogue in this movie goes into our next element to judge this movie by, which is the story. And just as with the dialogue, which has this like philosophical edge to it, the very story of this movie is framed on a philosophical level. Conan is on this revenge quest in the movie, but he's also on this philosophical journey. He's searching for the riddle of steel, and that takes on various meanings. And I think that's why this movie works so well because you can continually revisit it and unpack the meaning. John Milius, I think, beautifully crafted the movie and also made the smart creative choice, given the little amount of dialogue or the choice to have little dialogue. He also relies a lot on the music. Basil Pallador's score, and still to this day, one of the best film scores for me. The movie very much is reliant on the music and the score to carry it, and it very much lifts it up and elevates it. And I would say the same too with the sets of the movie. John Milius wanted real sets. We're getting to the world building aspect of it. You will have a good story if you can ground it in a believable world. And I think this movie just does that. Within its own terms and within the logic of that world, it feels grounded and lived in. As you're saying about campy movies and B movies, even when it leans into those campy elements, it elicits this visceral response. It may for some not elicit an emotional response. I think for us it did at times. Like, those battle sequences become very emotional when you're thrust into those action sequences.
I am emotionally invested in the revenge story, but more than that, there's just this visceral kinetic thrill of the battle scenes. And I think it has a lot to do with the idea that this is bloody carnage that we're watching. So the blood bags and just the fact that they just went all in, the blood that's flowing and popping out of the bodies,
Yeah.
it has this really intense florid quality to it that's really effective. And
Yeah.
those are still some of my favorite action sequences in film because I think that they are
Yeah.
um, as intense and over the top. And it implicates your body in an affective response with what you're watching. So it's
Mm.
you referred to it as pornographic earlier. I mean, Conan the Barbarian, the original one, is an example of a body genre film. It's in the same vein as horror films, pornography, and women's melodramas or soppy melodramas,
Yeah.
because an affective physical response is implicated in the content.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's also coming off a time too, like in the 70s, where they were in mainstream cinema introducing more pornographic elements into the movies. Like you had films like Caligula with actual hardcore sex scenes in them.
It's
And
worth noting that Conan the Barbarian originally got an X rating. I mean,
oh yeah, yeah, that's right. I'm not surprised. So I think this first movie really comes together in all of those elements, from the characters, the storytelling, world building, the influential battle sequences, and then well cast as well. I think everyone, primarily Arnold and James Earl Jones, I mean, really sell the movie as well. So I think that first movie really also was so influential for the sword and sorcery genre too, really establishing a lived in, believable, grounded world for these fantastical events to happen.
well, and I think the key there too is that Milius never tells when he can show. I mean, rather than having like a
Yeah,
voiceover dialogue where he says something like Conan and Subutai
yeah,
traveled to many cities and met many people and ate disgusting things on a stick. He shows us that, right? He shows us this gorgeous montage overlaid with Palladorus's music of them just running and traveling, and there's this sense of time and depth, and this is the whole wide world that they're in now, and
yes,
place and space and time and world come together and really kind of find expression, not on the level of exposition, but on the level of the visual, on the level of cinema.
yeah, 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 for sure. All right, so now when we shift gears and get into the follow-up sequel, Conan the Destroyer, different director, Michael Fleischer. Uh,
Richard Fleischer, I think.
oh, Richard Fleischer, excuse me.
Mm.
He also directed, I believe, the Red Sonja movie.
Yep.
Starting with the characters, the casting here, Arnold still looks the part. He's great as Conan, and you get the sense that Arnold is still playing the character how he played it, obviously, how he was playing it from the first movie, except that this is a different director, different tone entirely. And so the tone of this movie is more humorous. It's more family friendly and watered down.
Well, I mean, I think the film's a blast. It's
Yeah,
um it's a perfect Friday night flick, for me anyway. It's fun. I think that the battle scenes are great. I love the sword fights. I love the choreography of those. I love the idea that it's this traveling band of players, right? They've got this mission. It feels very much like a kind of Dungeons and Dragons kind of setup. They're on the quest. There's something they have to accomplish. They have to work together. And I think that it was cast really well. So you've got Tracy Walter as Malek, this sort of cowardly, feeble thief. You've got the just absolutely one of a kind Grace Jones playing this warrior Amazon, and
yeah,
she's wonderful, sort of similar to Schwarzenegger himself. She's such an indelible physical presence
Oh yes.
that it almost doesn't matter at a certain point whether or not she can act. I mean, she's just
Yeah.
when she's there, you can't help but look at her. You can't help
She
but be kind of
yeah.
enraptured by her.
A
And
raw intensity there. Like even when I was a
yeah,
kid watching this, like she stood out to me, and I was just like
mm.
struck by the sheer rawness of her performance. Yeah,
It was a formative moment for me as a kid because I was like, this is a dimension of female identity that I haven't seen before. And
yeah,
yet she was unmistakably female, feminine, unmistakably attractive, and yet not at all like anyone I'd ever seen before in the
yeah,
80s.
yeah,
So shout outs to her. Great character performance, great physicality, obviously. I mean, she was obviously an athlete. Um, but I think the film just succeeds on the level that it's placing itself in. It's this fun, fantastic sword and sorcery B movie that's very schmaltzy and very bubbly. Um, a great deal of humor, a great deal of levity. Conan, I mean, Schwarzenegger, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, he's playing it the way I think he played it to a certain extent in the first film. He feels a great deal less stoic and ponderous to me, though. I think that this is closer to the kind of Conan that you get in a lot of the Robert E. Howard stories, where the Conan character as this sort of nomadic, wanderlusting character is, um, sort of investing in the battle and the blood and the joy of that. Schwarzenegger doesn't quite get us there, right? But we do have that scene where he gets drunk and runs into Wilt Chamberlain, another imposing physical presence who I think contributes a lot to this movie. It still has Basil Polidoris' score. It doesn't have Milius's direction. It doesn't have Duke Callahan's cinematography. There are things there that I miss. But I think it's just totally suitable that they would tell a different kind of story. The revenge story has been told. This is one of the mistakes I think that I see people them making with the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that the emotional stakes of every story they tell have to be so damn high. So everything has to be an end game kind of scenario, right? I mean, with the X-Men for films, for instance, I just get exhausted. It's like, can we just have an adventure of the week? Can we just have a supervillain and a city in danger? And does it have to be the whole frickin' world or the whole frickin' universe every single time?
mhm,
And it's just so like I love that they just went with a kind of an episodic adventure where there isn't really the only personal stake for Conan, of course, is resurrecting Valeria. But really, it's just let's do this. Let's get paid. Let's have the adventure. Let's kill a bunch of people.
yeah,
Um, you know, and then I also shout outs to I think just amazing creature effects, great monster at the end, great set piece, great final battle. And that's not the only one either. The mirror, the room of mirrors sequence where he fights the wizard. The wizard turns himself into this strange ape creature, and they
yeah.
do battle. Is yeah, very much so in the vein of
Probably
that,
right
right?
the Frazetta cover right here. Yeah,
Yeah. And again, another great set piece. So I think the film just works. And I think that this is actually probably the two films we can most closely compare is the Destroyer and then the reboot, the 2011 reboot. They seem like tonally much more similar, even though I think the most recent film is trying to go for some combination of Conan the Barbarian and Conan the Destroyer.
yeah, yeah. The second movie, yeah, I think I like the serial nature of it. It does feel like an
Mm.
episode, and that is perfectly in keeping with the original stories, and also in its shift in tone, it's more fantasy than well, it has the sword and sorcery elements, obviously, and that
Mm.
level of violence and grit to it, but it's also bringing in more fantastical elements that you get in traditional fantasy, more creatures and magical events and happenings, has a fairy tale quality to it. That whole scene with the wizard. This movie feels like it's set almost in a different world, alternative world. Like I don't feel like the first movie and this sequel take place in the same world.
Yeah, no, very much so. I think it has to do a lot to do with the way the producers kind of took over. It does have
Yeah.
a lot to do with the different director too. I mean, Fleischer is
Yeah.
had a lunch pail mentality. You know, he was in there kind of like Howard Hawks to just get it done.
Yeah.
Kind of a studio man, so to speak. But then you've got John Milius, who's a ambitious new Hollywood auteur with artistic pretensions and a personal vision.
Yeah.
You can clearly, that is clearly legible.
Yeah.
It translates. Those films translate differently because of those different influences.
Back to the action, I think in terms of sequences, action scenes that top the movie for me, as you mentioned, the final confrontation between Conan and the god Dagoth. Uh, that was one of the best for me, and I do agree. I like the creature itself, the concept. I like that you have a guy in a suit, and that always works for me, even to this day, more than like a CGI creature. You know, for me, you always have to have like a physical anchor there. And even if it looks a little artificial, a little corny, it'll still have more of a visceral impact for me. There are some gory moments there, like when Conan is ripping the horn off him. I mean, that's some gross shit. I mean, even to this day, when I'm watching those scenes, like it'll give me a visceral reaction, like that is disgusting, you know? And so I total credit to this movie. It still has this visceral edge to it, this, rawness that is still in keeping with that first movie. Even though it's taking a more like fantasy tone. So that's how I differentiate the two. Whereas the first movie seems set in a history before our recorded history, but in the same chronology timeline. The second movie, Conan the Destroyer, seems set in an alternative, completely alternative fantasy world. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, it's much more like I said, Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I mean, I still enjoy it. And I still have that B movie appeal and camp to it that I enjoy. So, all right. Now we're gonna move on to the most recent Conan adaptation reboot from 2011. This one is directed by Marcus Nespo and casts Jason Momoa as the lead, Conan. A similar origin story, revenge plot as that first movie. The villain of this is now, what is this guy's name? It is
Pilar Zim,
Harlar Zim, played by the Avatar guy, Ste
Stephen Lang.
Stephen Lang. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
He plays the main antagonist. He's just a power-hungry warlord. I think Jason Momoa has the physical presence. I mean, he's basically playing himself, but I think in terms of Jason Momoa's persona, he's very much like Conan himself, has this devil-may-care attitude. And so I think he's well cast.
I have a mixed reaction to Momoa. I think that he looks awesome. He looks amazing. He looks like Conan should look. In addition to, the bare-chested physique, the muscliness and the fact that he's got this wonderful fire in his eyes, that classic Jason Momoa stare. He's also incredibly athletic. He's lithe. He moves really quickly. I think he captures one of the aspects of the original character's physicality, this idea that Conan isn't just this hulking muscular presence. He's also this lithe speed demon in battle, right? He has a speed and a quickness that opponents don't see coming, and I think you see that with Momoa. Um, on the other hand, I don't think that he carries the character on the level of dialogue. When he says something, I don't believe him. I don't believe there's a character behind those lines who has the force of will and the investment in them. And so it doesn't come off. It just falls flat for me. So wonderful as a physical specimen, great in the battle scenes, looks great. And of course, I think that Momo eventually improves as an actor. He's been good in other things, but I don't think he's great in this movie. I think that's a problem with the whole cast. I mean, Stephen Lang, who I normally think is very good, I don't think he has any credibility as Kala Zim. I don't the characters doesn't compel me, first of all, but I don't
Yeah.
Lang doesn't sell him as a character either. I'm not scared of him. I don't believe him when he says things. He
Yeah.
doesn't seem like a threatening presence. He doesn't seem like he's going to be any kind of real challenge. You know, it's an unfair comparison. He's walking in the shadow of James Earl Jones.
All his encounters with Stephen Lang's character, his confrontations, for some reason, like the editing just fell off in those battles action scenes when he had those confrontations, and then the final showdown is just felt like a dud for me. You know, it was just anticlimactic. There's not this propulsive movement and cathartic effect, you know, that the first movie had when Conan has his final confrontation with Thulsa Doom and his army.
The dynamic between them isn't compelling at all. I don't get the
Yeah,
sense that these two hate each other. I don't get the sense that there's some sort of special visceral connection that they have to pursue, that they're driven to pursue, or that
yeah.
Conan's driven to pursue. And again, it's just bad acting. I mean, I hate to say it because all these performers have been good, all except for Rachel Nichols. I just think she's bad, bad, bad. I think Tomorrow's,
They just didn't want her to be this side piece for Conan, you know, just this subservient female character, damsel in distress. So they have her be a trained warrior. And that just felt like shoehorned into it. There was no backstory to her character. She wasn't fleshed out and was underwritten. And also the actress wasn't very good. I mean, just physically, she couldn't sell the action. And it was another
get Grace
matter.
Jones. Next time, just get Grace Jones.
Yeah, it was another instance maybe of a combination of poorly written dialogue and a poorly written character. Looking at the movie as a whole, I can pick out elements that really worked and had a lot of potential. You know, for instance, his battle with like the Sand People.
That
Um,
was great.
that
Great
was
set piece.
awesome. Yeah, hands down for me, the best set piece of the movie. Like really, really awesome.
I think the film looks great. I agree with you that the film looks
Yeah.
really good. I think it has a nice look.
It does, yeah. I think you know, the visual style I think in terms of like the concept design, like the costumes and like the witch's makeup played by Rose McGowan, like her makeup is it didn't work for you?
Yeah, she's comically bad too. I just like people, everyone sucks in this movie. I don't know what it is because like I don't think she's a terrible actress, but I think that the film doesn't come off because of bad acting and a really a kind of poor script. But it had promise. It had potential.
It did, yeah. So I think yeah, I think we can both agree that that first movie, John Milius movie, is the peak moment for the Conan film franchise, still unbeatable. And I think I'm open to seeing the franchise be rebooted again and see if they can, you know, play around in that world some more. But still, that first movie really tops all the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
others. And those are our thoughts on the Conan franchise. Let us know if you're fans of the sword and sorcery genre. Do you like Conan? And share your thoughts below in the comments. And please subscribe, like, and we appreciate you watching. And we'll see you next time here.